What would you do if the man who bought your family's salvation leaned in during a waltz, surrounded by 500 of the wealthiest people in England, and told you to smile because everyone was watching his new prize? In the winter of 1815, beneath the blazing chandeliers of Stirling House, 23-year-old Lady Juliet Harrington stopped moving in the middle of a dance. The music stumbled. The silk of her silver gown settled around her like poured water. She did not raise her voice, but in the sudden, terrifying silence of the grand ballroom, she told the most powerful duke in the kingdom that he had bought her father's debts, but he had not bought her. And then she turned her back on £50,000, walked out through the enormous oak doors, and left the entire English aristocracy breathless. Settle in, draw your chair a little closer to the fire, let me know where you are watching from tonight, and stay close. Because this story begins in the kind of desperate, quiet poverty that hides behind the closed doors of grand houses. Juliet Harrington had not worn a new dress in 3 years. She lived in the echoing, drafty shell of Harrington Manor, a house that was slowly dying of her father's gambling debts. The silver had been sold. The horses were gone. The carpets were worn thin in the centers. On a Tuesday in November, Juliet was in the freezing kitchens, boiling water in a heavy iron kettle to wash the last of the decent linens. She did this herself so the scullery maid, whose hands were raw from the cold, could rest by the fire. Juliet carried the weight of her father's ruin with a quiet, unbreakable grace. When the butcher threatened to cut their credit, she had secretly walked into the village and traded her mother's pearls to keep the staff fed. She never complained. She simply held the crumbling walls of her life together with her own blistered hands. She did not yet know that her father had found a faster way to pay his markers. Lord Harrington called her into the morning room before noon. He was wearing his best coat, his face flushed with a greedy, desperate heat. He told her to go upstairs and put on the blue silk. They were expecting a visitor, the Duke of Stirling. Julian, the Duke of Stirling, was a man of ruthless precision. He owned shipping fleets, vast estates in the north, and half the men in Parliament. He was known across London as a man who calculated the value of everything and the humanity of nothing. He was 30 years old, unmarried, and he required a wife of impeccable noble birth to carry his legacy. Lord Harrington told his daughter, without looking her in the eye, that the Duke was coming to purchase her. £50,000 to clear the Harrington debts, save them from the debtor's prison, and leave a handsome allowance behind. Juliet stood by the cold fireplace. She did not scream. She did not weep. She listened to the sound of the wind rattling the loose glass in the window panes. She knew that if she refused, the servants would be turned out into the winter snow, and her father would hang himself in a cell. The trap was perfectly constructed. When the Duke's black carriage rolled into the overgrown drive, Julian stepped out as though he already owned the ground beneath his boots. He walked into the drawing room and placed a thick leather bank draft on the table. He looked at Juliet the way a man looks at a thoroughbred mare he has just acquired at auction. He noted her posture, the pale symmetry of her face, the quiet stillness of her hands. Her father reached for the draft with trembling fingers. Juliet spoke for the first time. She stepped forward and asked the Duke if she was not to be consulted on the price of her own life. Julian looked at her, mildly amused. He told her that most women would be grateful to a man who rescued them from ruin. Juliet held his gaze. She told him that if she agreed to this arrangement, it was to protect the servants of her house from starving, not out of gratitude to him. She told him he could purchase her presence, but he should never mistake her surrender for her respect. For a fraction of a second, surprise flashed in the Duke's gray eyes. He was accustomed to women who flattered him. He had never met a woman who looked at his immense fortune with utter, calm contempt. He told her they would announce the engagement that very night at his ball, and walked out. That evening, Stirling House was a palace of blinding light. Thousands of candles blazed in crystal chandeliers. When Juliet arrived, wearing a gown the Duke's dressmaker had delivered that afternoon, whispers followed her like a shadow. The Harrington girl, the purchased bride, £50,000 for a ruined daughter. Every word felt like a stone thrown against her back. Julian stood beside her in the receiving line, perfectly polite, entirely distant. He paraded her before his peers, demanding she smile, demanding she perform the role of the grateful, rescued bride. Near the edge of the dance floor, a young serving boy carrying a silver tray of crystal glasses tripped. The glass shattered across the polished marble. The head butler rushed forward instantly, his face purple with fury, shouting that the boy was dismissed, that he was to get out into the street immediately. The child dropped to his knees, weeping, trying to gather the broken shards with his bare, trembling hands. Without a second thought, without looking at the Duke or the watching nobles, Juliet stepped out of the receiving line. She dropped to her knees in her spun silver gown, right into the spilled wine. A gasp rippled through the nearest guests. The future Duchess of Stirling was kneeling in the dirt with a scullery boy. Julian stepped forward, his jaw tight. He told her to get up, that the servants would handle it. Juliet ignored him. She took the broken glass from the boy's hands and wiped his tears with her own lace handkerchief. She stood up, looked at the head butler, and told him the boy would stay. She told him that if he deducted the cost of the glasses from the child's wages, he would answer to her. In a room filled with the wealthiest people in England, this woman was entirely focused on the lowest servant. Julian stared at her. He realized, in that moment, that he had not bought a quiet, obedient wife. He had bought a woman whose dignity eclipsed his own. I want to pause here for a moment. Have you ever noticed how the people who have the least are often the ones who give the most? Juliet had lost everything: her home, her future, her freedom. Yet her first instinct was to protect a child who had less. But Julian was a man ruled by pride, and pride does not surrender easily. As the orchestra began to play a waltz, Julian reached for her hand. He pulled her into the center of the floor. He told her she had made a spectacle of herself. Juliet replied that she had shown compassion, something his ballroom was severely lacking. Julian's pride stung. He pulled her an inch closer. He told her she was a duchess now, that she represented his legacy, and then he whispered the words that broke the world in half. He told her to smile, because everyone was watching the prize he had won. The prize he had won. She was not a person to him. She was a transaction. She was a victory. Juliet stopped moving. She pulled her gloved hand from his shoulder. The music faltered and died into a terrifying silence. She looked up into his cold gray eyes, and she spoke so clearly that her voice carried to the velvet curtains at the far end of the room. She told him he had bought her father's debts, but he had not bought her. She turned her back on him. She did not run. She walked with perfect, unhurried dignity through the crowd of stunned aristocrats, out the grand doors, and out into the freezing London rain, leaving the diamond tiara resting on a marble table by the exit. Julian stood frozen in the center of the empty dance floor. For his entire life, His immense wealth had guaranteed him absolute obedience. He had believed that providing financial security was the greatest honor a man could bestow. But looking at the empty doorway, Julian suddenly realized how incredibly small he was. Juliet did not return to Harrington Manor. She knew her father would lock her away. Instead, she walked through the dark, rain-swept streets until she reached the poorer districts. She knocked on a small, battered door. It belonged to Mary, a former maid Juliet had secretly helped escape an abusive situation years ago. For the next 3 weeks, Juliet lived in that tiny, 2-room cottage. She traded her silver gown for plain wool. She learned to bake rough bread, to mend heavy linens, and to scrub floors on her hands and knees. She had never been poorer, and she had never felt so utterly free. Meanwhile, the Duke of Stirling's life had become a hollow echo. He sat in his massive study, staring at the bank drafts that usually brought him comfort. They meant nothing. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Juliet kneeling in the spilled wine. He saw the cold, unyielding truth in her eyes. He sent his men to find her, not to drag her back, but to ensure she was safe. When they told him she was living in a laborer's cottage in Cheapside, Julian ordered his grand carriage prepared. But as he reached the carriage door, he stopped. He realized that if he went in a gilded carriage, wearing a duke's coat, he was still the man trying to buy her. Julian turned back. He took off his gold-embroidered coat. He removed his signet ring. He dressed in a simple, worn riding jacket and heavy boots. He walked out of his grand estate on foot, stepping into the muddy streets of London as a common man. When Julian found the small cottage, he didn't knock on the front door. He walked around to the tiny yard in the back. Juliet was struggling to carry a heavy wooden bucket of water from the communal pump. Her hands were blistered. Her hair was tied back in a simple ribbon. Before she could lift the bucket over the step, a pair of strong hands took the handle from her. Juliet gasped. Julian stood there, holding the water. He was covered in street dust, his hair messy from the wind. He looked nothing like a duke. She stepped back, her breath catching, expecting demands or anger. Julian walked past her, set the bucket gently inside the kitchen, and walked back out into the yard. He looked at her, his voice stripped of all its usual arrogance. He told her he had offended her. He told her he had treated her like a ledger entry, that he had confused wealth with worth. He said he had come to apologize, not as a duke, but as a man who was deeply wrong. Juliet stared at him. She told him his apology was accepted and asked him to leave because he did not belong in a place like this. Julian smiled faintly. He agreed that he did not belong there, but he asked if he might stay, just to learn. This is the moment where the story turns on a hinge. Pay attention to what the Duke does next. He does not send her money. He does not buy the cottage. He rents a wretched room above a blacksmith shop across the street. Every morning, before Juliet woke, Julian chopped firewood for her cottage. When the grocer tried to cheat Mary on the price of flour, Julian stood quietly behind her until the man suddenly offered a fair price. He never used his title. He offered only his time, his labor, and his quiet protection. The arrogant Duke, who hated dirt, was now sweeping the cobblestones for the elderly woman next door. The man who valued perfect obedience was now laughing as stray dogs chased him down the alley. One rainy afternoon, as Juliet struggled to fix a leaking window frame, Julian appeared with a hammer. They worked together in silence. When they finished, he looked at her calloused hands and told her she was meant for silk. Juliet met his eyes. She told him she was happier in wool, because the wool belonged to her. Julian nodded slowly and told her that wool was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. For the first time, Juliet saw the man beneath the title. She saw a man willing to dismantle his entire ego just to stand near her. But peace is a fragile thing. The following week, a carriage thundered into the narrow street. Lord Harrington stepped out, accompanied by 3 large, brutal-looking men. He marched to the cottage door, kicked it open, and grabbed Juliet by the arm. He screamed that the Duke's lawyers were demanding their money back, that she had ruined him, and that she was coming home. He raised his hand to strike her. Before his hand could fall, a massive force grabbed his wrist. Julian stood there, his eyes blazing with a fury that made the 3 hired men instantly step back. Lord Harrington gasped, suddenly terrified, stammering that he was just bringing her back to his grace. Julian's voice was deadly quiet. He told Lord Harrington that she did not belong to him, and she did not belong to the Duke. Julian stepped aside, standing exactly shoulder to shoulder with Juliet. He did not stand in front of her to shield her like a possession. He stood beside her as an equal. He told her father that Juliet was a free woman. If she wished to stay in the cottage, she would stay. And if her father ever raised a hand to her again, Julian would personally ensure he spent the rest of his life in a cell so dark he would forget what the sun looked like. Without another word, Lord Harrington scrambled back into his carriage and fled. The street fell silent. Juliet stood in the doorway, her heart pounding. She looked at Julian, at his white knuckles and heavy breathing. She realized what he had done. She asked him if he had given the money back. Julian looked down. He told her his lawyers had voided the contract. He had absorbed the loss himself. She was free of her father's debts. She owed him nothing. He turned to walk away, believing he had to leave her to the freedom she had fought so hard for. Juliet called his name. She stepped out of the cottage, closing the distance between them. She looked up into the eyes of the man who had traded his entire world just to learn how to respect hers. She reached out, gently touching his dirt-stained sleeve. She told him he had not bought her, but he had earned her. They were married a month later, not in a grand cathedral in London, but in the small, drafty village church at the end of the street. Mary stood as Juliet's maid of honor. The baker, the blacksmith, and the local children filled the pews. When Duke Julian and Duchess Juliet returned to Stirling House, they did not return to the old ways. Juliet opened the estate's massive kitchens to feed the poor. Julian used his vast wealth to build schools and hospitals, tearing down the debts of the desperate instead of buying them. And every year, on the anniversary of their engagement ball, the Duke of Stirling would ask his wife to dance. Not in front of 500 nobles, but alone, in the quiet of their own home, where no one was watching. Thank you for staying to the end of this beautiful journey, for walking with Juliet from the gilded cage of a ballroom to the quiet freedom of a cottage, and for believing, as she did, that true love cannot be purchased, it can only be earned. If this story touched your heart, leave a kind word below. Tap the subscribe button and follow along for the next tale, because if you don't, you owe me a dance by the time the next waltz begins.